knew we were going to have great panels and great ideas on stage. The thing that surprised me so far today is how much heart we're seeing on stage. So let's hope we can keep that going here. We got 20 minutes on the clock. Our tentative title that we threw out was that we were going to solve the housing crisis in 20 minutes. You rejected that title that I gave you.
Hang on.
But let's start, and I think a lot of people have this idea. We go to a lot of cities. It seems like every city has a housing crisis. Those housing crises don't go away. Even after COVID, the rents in New York are not any lower. People are lined up around the street. Homelessness is still obviously a problem. What is it about housing that is so inscrutable that the market just can't provide the solution?
Well, thanks, Dan. And it's really great to be here. My first time actually in Charleston. Fortunately, it's going to be too short because I've got to get back to hazy Washington, D.C. But in any event, I think, look, in short, it's everything, everywhere, all at once, with everyone. That's really the problem, is that it is so deeply complex. And so there is no simple solution to solving it, particularly when you look at it through the perspective of affordable housing. I also think that we had a very interesting conversation in the lead up to this, and one of the sort of trends of thought right now, particularly in the United States, but also in other market-based economies, is that the market was not made to be affordable. If you think about what most people think about in the market, when you think about your houses and where you live, you want those to appreciate. And that's what markets are for, to spur demand and meet that with supply, et cetera. But there is sort of a built-in, not just implication, but quite explicit expectation that prices will rise. Well, for those of us who have a house and have a mortgage and all that, that's great. It's not for the millions who are not in the market. And so that also makes it extraordinarily complex. And so I think starting with the realization that, particularly for those of us who are in comfortable homes with nice mortgages, we've all enjoyed a massive subsidy for as long as there's been Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. So for decades, there's been a huge subsidy to fuel this market. And I think we just need to be realistic about what it's going to take to solve the affordable housing crisis, which, yes, is going to require some subsidy, some compromise, et cetera. But reaching that, as we've heard from some of the other speakers today, is difficult.
So Habitat for Humanity, everyone knows it. Everybody knows what it does. You build houses. You're building 2 houses in my town, not too far away from my house. Building one house at a time takes time. And it's going to take a long time to get everybody housed. You're sort of pivoting and taking a more systemic approach. Can you talk a little bit about how you're trying to solve the larger problem and really scale the solutions?
Yeah, I think Habitat has been around since 1976, and since 1976, it has housed 46 million people. That's a lot, but it's not enough. Right now, one of the numbers that we're all getting attuned to is that there are currently, as we speak around the globe, 1.8 billion people who are not housed at all or are in inadequate housing. And if current trends continue, which is largely a factor of urbanization, by 2030, that number could be 3 billion. So a couple of years ago, the CEO of Habitat, Jonathan Reckford, asked the team, if we keep doing what we're doing, by when will we meet our mission, which is quite literally to make sure everyone has a decent place to live. And they came back with some estimate of 25 something or another. He said, we're going to have to get there another way. And so in the last year, the strategic pivot is build and influence. And the importance of that is, yes, Habitat will continue to build, and very much build in the way that it has always built, which is really around bringing volunteers and community together to build mostly single-family homes. And that's great, and that's going to continue. It's very much part of the brand. It's part of the ethos. It has always been about more than just building the house. It also has been about building habitats and healthy communities. But even people at Habitat will admit it is neither the quickest nor the cheapest way to provide shelter. And so in that context, really leveraging up our knowledge of how to build, including the full array of things that need to be done in terms of accessing land and bringing in the finance and all the other things. That Habitat knows how to do that. We need to get more people to understand how to do that. And that's where the influence piece comes in. And it's not just influencing policy and advocacy, that's part of it, but it's also about market systems, getting the private sector and the 10 Ps, if you will, to join in and to solve the shelter problem.
What are some success stories or examples of projects you've been involved with that are sort of addressing these things head on?
Yeah, I think at the TCIS, by the way, stands for the Terwillinger Center for Innovation and Shelter, although I normally just say TCIS because otherwise my time would be up in most instances. But what we do is we focus on, first of all, we work mostly globally, internationally. Most of my team is not in the United States. We have offices in Mexico, Peru, Kenya, India, Philippines, and a group in Europe. And we use what's called a market systems development approach. Some of you may have heard it referred to as a housing ecosystems approach, but essentially we try and look at all 10 of those players, all of the full supply chain of what it takes to provide a house, and try and figure out the point in the market that we feel has the greatest potential to accelerate the delivery of affordable housing at scale. And there's a whole approach to that. But we tend to focus on finance, entrepreneurship and innovation, entrepreneurship and enterprise, and construction processes and materials. And so some of the successes we've had in that context, we have a $100 million fund called Microbuild, which actually is in its 8th of 10 years, and so it's in its wind down phase. And that's a global fund. It's been dispersed in 33 countries around the world. And on the basis of $100 million, we've actually leveraged $1 billion worth of financing into affordable housing in those 33 countries. We're about to go to market by the end of this year with a second fund that hopefully will be about $500 million. We also have something we call Shelter Tech, which essentially is an accelerator for early stage startup and scale up businesses. And just to give a couple of examples, there's one that recently won a World Economic Forum award about a year ago called Magic Water out of Kenya that basically provides potable water solutions for people in informal settlements mostly. There's another company called Cubic, which takes plastics and recycles them into bricks. Some of you may have seen a video that was advertising a campaign that Habitat is doing called Home Equals. Although it's not mentioned in the video, the company that is profiled there is one of our Shelter Tech companies. They make interlocking bricks. And so a lot of our work with entrepreneurs and enterprise really, it didn't start off with this, but is very much in the sustainability space. Lots of plastic recycling using local materials, circular economy is very much a feature. As a matter of fact, if we look at the portfolio through that lens, more than 80% of the businesses there are somehow in some version of sustainability. So those are some of the successes. And when I say success, it really is, when I took on this job about 3.5 months ago, coming in, I said, look, innovation for me is not about new and nifty. There's lots of new and nifty out there. If it doesn't scale, it doesn't matter. And so, we really are not so much looking for everything that's brand new, but we're looking for things that have the potential for scale, and all of those things that I've mentioned, we are seeing uptake in the market for them at scale.
What are the, again, everybody wants to solve the housing crisis. Nobody's opposed to affordable housing, although sometimes they're opposed to it in their neighborhood. But what are the biggest obstacles you're finding, particularly when it comes to solving the housing crisis in cities?
It's affordability. I mean, and affordability has many dimensions. As pretty much probably everyone in this room knows, the cost of building materials is shot through the roof. And, prices are pretty sticky. It's not like they've plummeted post-COVID. And so that, the cost of materials, the cost of finance. I was just at a World Bank conference, the Global Affordable Housing Conference last week in Washington. And I would say if you could ask 300 people at a conference, what is the number one issue that is keeping affordable housing from happening, it would be finance. It would be the cost of finance or the accessibility of finance. And accessibility really has more to do with the terms and conditions around who can get it and who can't. So really affordability is what it boils down to. And so a lot of our a lot of the innovations that we promote, again, as I said, I'm not all that interested in new and nifty if it's not affordable. And so one of the things that we do with many of our corporate partners is, yes, we may be helping them develop a new cement that's more resilient to earthquake damage or humidity in particular markets. But if they can't lower the cost point of what's already available, then it's just a nice technology that I can't use. So affordability is a constant factor in everything that we do, whether it's finance, whether it's materials, whether it's entrepreneurship and enterprise. That really is the number one challenge that we're trying to address.
And I think it also runs counter to those market forces we talked about earlier, where it's not about the new and nifty, paying a premium, taking a higher price. It's like bare minimum, let's make this as affordable as possible. You often make the least amount of money on those types of projects.
Sure, but the promise, of course, is in scale. And it also is, and this is where the 10 Ps become very important, because different people are looking for different value out of affordable housing. If you think about it one of the things that we implement is something we also call a human-centered design approach. And so everything that we do has to accord to what the consumer, i.e. the person building their home or the person who's going to occupy the home, wants. And from that perspective, their interest isn't necessarily appreciation in the value of the house. Many people in the markets that we work in are looking at it as a possible source of income. Many of them are looking for, they're in many societies, multi-generational living is common. They're looking for it to be close to a place of work, et cetera. The cities, again, as we've heard here, whether it's U.S. cities or cities overseas, I'd say generally we're talking about livability. And so the return on investment is not for everyone purely the financial ROI. And so it's really about trying to balance those who want and need to generate a certain return on capital versus all the other returns that people are looking for, and trying to find value in that. And also, as we've found, finding economic and financial value in things that weren't previously seen as having economic and financial value. I mean, telling the stories of African Americans, be they in Charleston or be they in Boston, et cetera, is attracting a new market. Mm-hmm. So it need not necessarily be a zero-sum game.
You're based in Washington. Obviously, lobbying and getting policymakers on board plays a critical role here. What are some of the challenges in the lobbying efforts and the education efforts as you reach out to city officials?
I think it's really the education aspect of it, and less the advocacy sort of is what it is, but it really is that education element that is so critical. And I think also, helping legislators to understand the complexity of the problem. Kind of goes back to the first thing that we talked about, that housing is not just a housing problem. And so coming at the problem, for example, from a sustainability and ecological perspective, coming at it from an economic perspective, coming at it from a social perspective, there actually are many sort of levers that you can use to get a legislator to care about housing. If you come in and say, we're going to talk about housing and we want you to pass XYZ housing bill, eyes are likely to kind of glaze over and go, housing again. But if you figure out that this person is really passionate about the environment, if you figure out that they're really passionate about social justice, so on and so forth, I think we're finding that is gaining a bit more currency and success as we try and push for the advocacy campaign. And the advocacy campaign that we right now just launched about 2 weeks ago, called Home Equals, interestingly enough, is about trying to address and ultimately eradicate informal settlements. Now, in the U.S., you don't really hear that term, informal settlements, but if any of us have driven past an interstate freeway with an overpass and we see people underneath it, what is that? It's an informal settlement. We tend to use slightly different language, but informal settlements are everywhere. And they really are the face of homelessness as well as inadequate housing. Now, like you say, everyone in theory is in favor of affordable housing until it's somewhere near them, and then all of a sudden they're not. Well, okay, I get that. But again, if you can get folks to understand the ecological and the environmental aspects of that, if you get to understand who's actually in those places and why they're there, then I think you can begin to kind of change the advocacy conversation from one of just, where are we going to put these people, to one of, perhaps there's an opportunity here to achieve other objectives that we may have that aren't just purely about putting some people in some houses.
Is there anything on the horizon, either from a technological side or a systemic side, that you're optimistic about, that you think is actually going to be making major impact on this sort of a inscrutable problem?
Yeah, I've touched on it already, but I do think that sort of net zero or sustainability is really where we're seeing a tremendous amount of interest, a tremendous amount of capital, a tremendous number of solutions coming to bear. And again, in the context of innovation, I think that what we're seeing is that if you take the entirety of what many of these solutions are about, whether they're circular economy solutions around plastic, or whether they're about taking just earth and basically making earthen bricks, or whether they're taking making water potable, et cetera, that you're actually, if you do the full math, you're actually reducing costs and creating economic opportunity in one place that didn't exist before. And so those solutions actually can be more affordable to those who are using them. So it's not just, we want to try and provide shelter to this community that doesn't have it and put them in sustainable shelter because of the ecological impact, but because it helps us to move to a new economy where you can derive different returns out of different economic activities. So, and it's also where a lot of capital is. I mean, this $500 million fund that we're going to be raising for later this year, a lot of the preliminary conversations we've had, a lot of people are saying, well, if you've got a climate angle, then I'm interested. If we don't, they don't particularly want our money. They don't particularly want to invest in our fund. And we already sort of had that in our design, but it's being confirmed. So I do think that climate, net zero, sustainability, goes by many names, is really where things are going.
I think once again, you're pointing out there's the housing problem, but then there's lots of different motivations to actually solve it. And climate's definitely one of them. Roland, thanks so much for talking to us today. This is a great presentation.
Dan, thank you. Thank you.